The morning Richard left, Dorothy Callahan was making oatmeal. She remembers that detail with strange clarity. The way the wooden spoon moved in slow circles, the steam rising from the pot, the radio playing something soft and forgettable in the corner of the kitchen. She remembers the smell of brown sugar. She remembers thinking she needed to buy more milk. She does not remember hearing the door close. That part came quietly, the way most devastations do. By the time she turned around, 40 years of marriage had walked out the front door with a rolling suitcase and a set of car keys. Richard left a note on the kitchen counter, folded once, her name written on the outside in his neat accountant's handwriting. She didn't open it for 3 hours. She just stood there in the kitchen, stirring oatmeal that had long gone cold, wondering how a person could be so completely blindsided by something that, looking back, had been coming for years. Dorothy was 63 years old. She had spent 4 decades as a wife, a mother, a keeper of the house on Elmwood Drive. She had raised 2 children in this house, buried a dog in the backyard, planted roses along the fence that still bloomed every June without being asked. She had given this life everything she had, and now she was standing alone in a kitchen that suddenly felt like someone else's. The note said he was sorry. It said he had met someone. It said he hoped she would be okay. She folded it back up and put it in the drawer, with the take-out menus and the expired coupons, and she never read it again. The divorce was handled by lawyers Dorothy couldn't really afford. Richard's attorney was sharp and efficient. Hers did his best. What came out the other side was this. The house had a second mortgage Dorothy hadn't known about. The savings account had been quietly drained over 18 months. The retirement fund, split evenly, left her with enough to survive for perhaps 2 years if she was extremely careful. The car was Richard's. The furniture stayed. The debt stayed too. Her daughter Michelle flew in from Portland and cried at the kitchen table. Her son Greg called from Denver and said all the right things in the wrong tone, the tone of a man who was already calculating how much this might cost him. Dorothy listened to both of them and nodded and said she would be fine. She was not fine. She was terrified in a way she had no language for. Not the sharp terror of an accident or a diagnosis, but the slow, grinding terror of a woman who has just realized that the life she built on someone else's foundation has crumbled, and she is standing in the rubble with 63-year-old knees and no blueprint for what comes next. The house had to be sold. That much was clear. After the mortgage was paid, there would be almost nothing left. Michelle offered her the spare room in Portland. Greg offered to help her find a small apartment. Friends from church brought casseroles and kind words and the well-meaning, suffocating sympathy of people who had no idea what to say. Dorothy thanked everyone. She accepted the casseroles. She did not move to Portland, because there was one thing Richard had left behind. One thing that hadn't been mentioned in the divorce proceedings because nobody had thought to mention it. One thing that sat at the end of the driveway, like a forgotten sentence. The old garage. It was a detached structure separate from the house, built sometime in the 1950s by the original owners. Wooden frame, metal roof, 2 wide doors that groaned when you opened them. Richard had used it as a storage space for the first 20 years of their marriage, then slowly stopped going in there at all. Dorothy couldn't remember the last time either of them had opened those doors. 5 years ago, 7. She had walked past it 10,000 times without looking at it. The morning after Michelle flew back to Portland, Dorothy woke up at 5 in the morning, unable to sleep, and walked to the end of the driveway in her robe and slippers. The grass was wet. The neighborhood was still dark. She stood in front of those 2 old doors and felt something she couldn't quite name. Not hope. Not exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something like curiosity. Something like the faint, stubborn instinct of a woman who has not yet decided to give up. She lifted the latch. She pulled the doors open. The smell hit her first. Dust and oil and something older, something wooden and faintly sweet. She found the light switch on the wall and a single bulb flickered on overhead. And Dorothy Callahan stood very still in the doorway and looked at what 40 years of forgotten storage had left behind. There were boxes stacked against every wall, old furniture covered in drop cloths, garden tools hanging from hooks, bins of holiday decorations, but that wasn't what stopped her breath. Along the right wall, wrapped carefully in moving blankets and bungee-corded into stillness, were pieces of furniture that she recognized from Richard's parents' house. Old pieces, heavy dark wood pieces, with ornate carvings and brass hardware, that she had always assumed were simply old. A dresser, a writing desk, a tall cabinet with glass doors, a rocking chair with a curved back, and tucked against the far wall, almost hidden behind a stack of flattened boxes, a painting. It was about 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, framed in a thick gilded frame that had gone dark with age. The image was of a countryside, soft greens and blues, handled with a delicacy that made Dorothy lean closer without meaning to. She didn't know art. She had never claimed to know art, but something about this painting made her feel the way she felt the first time she heard a piece of music that reached inside her chest and rearranged something. She stood there for a long time in the cold morning light, looking at it. Then she went inside and made herself a cup of coffee, and she started doing research. Before we go any further, if this story is speaking to something in you, please stay until the end, because what happened next is the part that matters. And if you haven't yet, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel, because we tell stories here that are worth staying for. Dorothy had never owned a smartphone until her daughter made her get one 2 years ago. She had learned to use it slowly, reluctantly, the way people learn to use things they don't fully trust. But that morning, sitting at her kitchen table with cold fingers and a racing heart, she was grateful for it. She photographed everything: the dresser, the writing desk, the cabinet, the rocking chair, the painting. She spent 3 hours inside that garage with her phone and a flashlight, cataloging every item she found. Then she called an antiques appraiser. His name was Thomas Birch, and he came on a Wednesday afternoon with a soft-spoken manner and eyes that moved around a room the way a doctor's hands move over a patient, careful, trained, missing nothing. Dorothy led him to the garage and stood back and watched him work. He didn't say much for a long time. When he stopped in front of the painting, he went very still. Dorothy's heart knocked against her ribs. He asked if she knew where the painting had come from. She told him it had belonged to her late father-in-law, Walter Callahan, who had worked in antique trade for decades. Before his death in 1987, she told him she had never paid it much attention. Thomas Birch turned and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Mrs. Callahan," he said carefully, "I want to be very clear that I would need to send this for formal authentication before I say anything definitive. But if this painting is what I think it might be," he paused, "you should call an attorney before you call anyone else." It took 11 weeks. 11 weeks of phone calls and emails, and a trip to a specialist in Boston, and paperwork and waiting and more waiting, and trying to sleep through nights that refused to end. Michelle called every few days. Greg called twice. Dorothy's friend Carol, who had been her closest friend for 30 years, came over every Sunday and sat with her in the kitchen and didn't ask questions. Dorothy couldn't answer yet. The painting was authenticated in February. It was a mid-19th century landscape by an American artist, whose work had become significantly more valuable in the past 2 decades. A work of his had sold at auction 3 years prior for nearly $400,000. Dorothy's painting was smaller, less celebrated, but it was genuine, well-preserved, and belonged to a collector's market that Thomas Birch described, in his careful, understated way, as very active. It sold at a regional auction house in March for $260,000. Dorothy was sitting in Carol's kitchen when the auctioneer called. She listened. She said thank you. She set the phone down on the table. Then she put her face in her hands and wept in a way she hadn't wept since the day the divorce was finalized. But this time the crying came from somewhere different, not from loss. Not from humiliation or grief or the hollow ache of a life dismantled. This crying came from something she had almost stopped believing. She was allowed to feel relief, raw, rib-cracking relief. But here is what the money could not do. And this is the part Dorothy wants people to understand, because she has told this story now to her grandchildren and to her pastor, and to a woman she met at a coffee shop who was going through her own version of the same earthquake. And she always makes sure to say this part clearly. The money did not fix the 40 years. It did not answer the questions she still sometimes asked herself in the dark. What she had missed, what she had accepted, what she had quietly let go of in herself in order to keep the peace, to keep the home, to keep things moving smoothly. It did not undo the humiliation of sitting in a lawyer's office and learning about a second mortgage on a house she had believed was hers. It did not give back the version of herself that had stood at a kitchen stove on a quiet Tuesday morning, stirring cold oatmeal, unable to hear a door closing on everything she had known. That woman was gone. Dorothy knew it, and for a long time she had thought that was only a loss. It took a dusty garage and a painting she had walked past 10,000 times to show her that it could also be a beginning. She did not move to Portland. She found a small house in the same town, close enough to Carol, close enough to the church where she had sung in the choir for 22 years, close enough to the garden center where she bought her roses every spring. It was a modest house with a good kitchen and a window seat in the living room that got afternoon light, and the first morning she woke up in it, she lay in bed for a while listening to the birds and feeling something she worked to identify. Before she recognized it, quiet, clean and uncomplicated quiet that was entirely her own. She took a class at the community center on the history of American art. She wasn't sure why exactly. Something about the painting had opened a door in her she hadn't known was there. She sat in those classes on Tuesday evenings, surrounded by people 20 years younger than her, and took notes in a yellow legal pad and asked questions without embarrassment. She learned that Walter Callahan, the father-in-law she had always found slightly distant and difficult to read, had known exactly what he had. He had simply never told anyone. She thought about that sometimes, about what it means to keep your knowledge to yourself, about what it means to leave something behind for someone without a note of explanation, without a roadmap, letting them find their way to it in their own time. She liked to think he would have been pleased it was her. Richard called once, about 8 months after the auction. Dorothy never knew exactly how he'd heard. Small towns carry stories whether you want them to or not. He called on a Thursday afternoon and his voice had that careful, measured quality she now recognized as the sound of a man who wanted something but wasn't going to say so directly. He asked how she was. She said she was well. He said he'd heard things had worked out for her. She said yes, she supposed they had. There was a pause. She did not fill it. She wished him well. She meant it. Not because she had forgiven him easily. She hadn't, but because carrying 40 years of anger is heavier than carrying 40 years of love. And Dorothy had decided she was done carrying things that weren't worth the weight. She set the phone down and went to water her roses. The last thing Dorothy did with a portion of that money was something that surprised even Carol. She had the old garage fully restored. New roof, new doors, refinished floors, proper lighting. She donated the remaining furniture, authenticated and appraised, to a local historical preservation society. And inside the restored garage, she set up a proper workspace. Not for anything practical, not for storage or parking or tools. She had taken up painting. She wasn't good, not yet, maybe not ever, in any way that would matter to anyone outside her own kitchen. But on Saturday morning she stood in that little restored space with afternoon light coming through a new side window, and she painted the countryside in the way she remembered it. From that old canvas, soft greens and blues, handled carefully, handled with patience. She was 64 years old. She had survived the thing she had always feared most. She had opened a door she hadn't opened in years and found that what was waiting inside was not emptiness. It was hers, all of it, finally and completely hers. The oatmeal she had been making the morning. Richard left. She never made it again. Not because it hurt to remember, but because she realized, sometime in the winter after everything changed, that she had never actually liked oatmeal. She had made it because Richard did. She makes eggs now, every morning the way she likes them. with too much butter and a little hot sauce and the radio turned up loud. Small things, but they are all hers, and she has decided that is more than enough. None of 5 words, complete, powerful ending.